Now, Cabinet Minister Michael Gove suggested that COVID could be man-made after telling the inquiry yesterday that there was a significant body of judgment that considered the virus to be not natural. Well, yeah, tell us something we don't know, Michael Gove. Joining me right now is Francis Hoar, who's a public law barrister and one of those who, played a very important role in trying to actually overturn an awful lot of the COVID policies that we had to endure for a number of years that, as we know, failed to save anyone's lives. Francis Hoar, thank you so much for joining us.
Afternoon, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, Michael Gove is actually probably the most senior person who's had such an incredible role throughout the COVID pandemic. He was one of the 4 cabinet ministers making all the decisions, chaired the COVID Operations Committee throughout, and actually, I know from other cabinet ministers and civil servants who spoke to me, was playing a crucial role in driving a lot of those lockdown policies and tier policies as well. He issued an apology which we actually played out on the show yesterday, taking his opportunity to share his responsibility for things that they got wrong. Let's play a little bit of that first, because I want to get your reaction to that. Here's what he had to say when he was apologising.
I want to take this opportunity, if I may, my lady, to apologise to the victims who endured so much pain, the families who endured so much loss as a result of the mistakes that were made by government in response to the pandemic. And as a minister responsible for the Cabinet Office and who was also close to many of the decisions that were made, I must take my share of responsibility for that. Michael Gove apologising, it's all very well, mistakes were made, and we will accept that, you know, these are unprecedented times, mistakes were made, but of course, the biggest mistake, for which he's never apologised, and certainly I've had private conversations with him about this, it was to lock down and ignore all pre-pandemic planning hitherto when they did that in March 2020.
That's an extraordinary comment by Mr. Gove, because what the state is responsible for is the consequences of its policies. It's not responsible for the unknown consequences of a respiratory virus, which we have every 20 years or so. We had a very similar quantity of deaths in the winter period in 1999-2000 for a winter flu that's not even considered to be a pandemic. It is responsible, however, for shutting down the NHS to almost anyone who did not suffer from COVID, to discouraging people from seeing their GPs, to preventing people from having treatments and having consultations with consultants, knowing that that would cause death, because as you say, that was predicted in the pandemic plans, which strongly suggested and strongly advised against anything approaching lockdown. They even advised against, for example, test and trace after the very earliest stages of the pandemic. So he knows that. Also, it's, as you say, it's established that the deaths in the United Kingdom show that the lockdown did not have an effect on them, because the infections that caused those deaths started to peaked well before lockdown.
Yeah. Professor Simon Wood. I'm amazed by how many people don't know that. I mean, you have to look at the graphs, the dates where people, reported to, when people went into hospital. We know how long it took for people to get that ill. But this is the thing. Jenny Harries, the former deputy chief medical officer, she's now running, the health pandemic planning and policy right now. But she spoke openly in the early months about, the masks don't work. There's no evidence for them. We don't close schools. There's no point in having the mass testing. And we had Chris Whitty, we had Patrick Vallance in press conferences at Number 10, standing alongside the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, saying, look, you can't stop a virus. Well, yeah, that was why all pre-pandemic planning was clear that you don't lock down, because all you're going to do is delay the virus getting to other people, and you getting to people it's going to get to anyway, and you're going to have all of those other impacts, as we have seen. Let's also have a listen to what he had to say about the virus being man-made, because he seemed to bring this up as some sort of revelation, but also as an excuse for failures. Let's have a listen and a watch to what Michael Gove said about this.
There is a significant body of judgment that believes that the virus itself was man-made.
Well, I mean, yeah, this is not news to anyone who's paying attention, is it, Francis?
It's not news, and I actually think the question of the virus's origins has some importance, but it's much less important than analysing and scrutinising what the government did in response to the virus, whether man-made or not. And what's extraordinary about the inquiry is, as you say, Julia, all pandemic planning, all historical modern efficacy and evidence about how you deal with pandemics suggested that this was a huge mistake, and nobody even contemplated it before the Chinese did it. And yet Baroness Hallett isn't even scrutinizing the fact that those pandemic plans were ditched. She isn't questioning, as a matter of principle within the inquiry, whether or not the government should have locked down. That's a question that is
literally the only worthwhile question.
In terms of reference.
It's the only thing they should be asking.
It's the only important question, Julia, because what we're looking at is an unprecedented assault by the state on freedoms, on health, on prosperity, on education, as you've said. And yet that is the one thing that isn't scrutinised. Instead, because Lady Hallett didn't allow participant status to anyone challenging the lockdown, we don't have any cross-examination of the witnesses about asking any of the questions that they should be asked about that pandemic planning, about the evidence behind masks, about the evidence behind the tears, about why they were doing that. And yet we have the yes party and the yes sir party, to paraphrase what used to be described as
that's
Iran.
exactly, I couldn't agree with you more. And yet we're going to persevere. We've got Matt Hancock tomorrow, and again I think we're just going to have a load more tittle tattle and who said who to what and in their WhatsApp groups, as opposed to talking about the actual important stuff.